Abstraction is a language that does not involve direct association to representational content or meaning. It frees itself from those obligations to elevate itself to having content which in many instances has not been experienced, involving shape and color and the structure of space. First, I grew up in a very middle-class family. Being an artist was never considered to be a profession. However, since I was quite young, even after I was born, I lived with my grandmother in Mercedes, Texas. We're talking about 1940. And there was no movies, no television, there was no visual information. I spent most of the time on my grandmother's porch drawing. I also, when I was very young, 12 years old or so, I would take art classes at a local art store in the basement, and I worked from the figure and from still life. From that point on, all the way through college, I was trained as a figurative artist, working from models and still lifes. Nobody in college or before that period taught anything about color. I was quite fortunate when I spent the better part of my junior year in college touring Europe, and I ended up living in Spain for 2 years. And I think that I changed my whole understanding of art, not looking at slides in a dark room, but actually looking at the work of art itself. I came back to the United States and got a job as a guard in the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. We were required every day as guards to go in to the museum an hour early and clean up the museum, vacuum the floor. But I spent an hour alone with these masterpieces. And from that direct observation, you sort of learn a great deal about a particular artist. There was a Cezanne self-portrait, which was quite remarkable, how he modulated the color together to build the facial structure of the self-portrait. But in all of those experiences, I didn't really have a clear understanding of what color was. I got a job when I graduated from college to be a studio assistant to Carl Knotts in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Carl Knotts was an American Cubist. He was also a first-generation German, and he had developed a color system that came out of a man named Oswald, who had built a color system cataloging all the different hues that could be seen. And he developed a way of modulating those hues in his Cubist format, which was representational. But it was a way of building the structure of color through using hue, value, and saturation. What was kind of interesting about it is that period in history, and we're talking about the 60s, there was not a lot of information that had been translated from the Bauhaus to English. In the afternoons, he would, because he was first generation German, he would read the German version of what had been translated in English, and I would listen to the English version. But in doing so, I started to learn a lot about what the Bauhaus was about. They had teachers like Eden, who had built his own color system. There were Paul Klee, there was Kandinsky, there was a host of artists who developed color systems, and I was able to learn from that. And I started to think about what color was. I had a little cottage that he gave me where I painted. I started to use a lot of color in my painting, but they were very abstract. So I started to think in the evening, sitting there alone, what my paintings were about. What I was attracted to most in the painting was the color itself. And I started to pull my chair up, oddly enough, right next to the color and try to disregard all different types of shape that were in the paintings that I was working on. After a while, I started to think, well, why not get rid of the shape altogether and just have a grid of color? So there would be no distraction of looking at anything except an individual color. I started to build grid paintings, and I saw that color, each color, had its own particular attitude or its own particular feeling. And I started to wonder, scientifically, what does that mean? I hadn't at that point had any literature that I could actually read. There was no internet. So I started to do some research, and I ran into a whole body of information about Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton was the Englishman, as everybody knows, in the 1700s, who determined that color was contained in light with his experiments with prisms. And in doing so, he started to theorize that there were 7 major hues, 7 major colors that made up the spectrum, and that the spectrum came from the electromagnetic spectrum, which is a spectrum of energy. So Newton came out and he said, look, color is actually energy. It's wavelengths of energy that enters your eye and changes your perception, because it does. Then he did something which I thought was absolutely incredible. He theorized that color was related to the diatonic scale of music, that those 7 notes in the diatonic scale related to the 7 colors of the spectrum. To me, that was absolutely amazing, because what it meant is that he believed that these colors were interrelated and could build the same type of structure that Beethoven or Mozart was dealing with in music. And that confirmed something that I'd been thinking about for a long time. And as I know, for centuries, artists accepted that through direct observation. Karl Knotz in Provincetown's wife was a pianist, a very elegant classical pianist. Karl, developed a painting based on an abstraction using color and shape. Unbeknownst to him, I would go in the afternoon and I looked through his living room window as I went up the steps, and he had taken the painting that he'd just done, put it on his wife's piano. He did not himself know anything about piano, but for every color and space, he assigned a note. So he actually, with his fingers, would play, this is 2 notes because it's 2 modules of space in yellow, and that's a certain key. And then he would play the next one. In a very crude form, he played that painting. The eye, according to perceptual psychologists, you and I can see anywhere from 100,000 to 1,000,000 separate colors. My quest was, how was I to get this information out purely as color so you could experience it? And so I started to build these large grid paintings that had 200 colors in them or more, or smaller, to get at the sensation of color that changed your encounter with something that can only be experienced through the pure color itself. The major hues have this wavelength of energy. This energy goes down the optic nerve into your brain. So you're actually being changed physically by looking at a color. And you're responding to that. Now it's subtle, but you're actually being transformed into another state of feeling. If you give the color enough time, it will transform you. These paintings, for example, you don't have to look at directly. You could even be in the environment where it changes you. And what's odd, people will spend time picking out colors for their houses, for their bedrooms, for their bathrooms. They'll pick out draperies. Women, I'm fascinated, pick out colors for their lips, for their apparel, for their hair. They're picking out energy they want to have be reflected from their physiology. I'm trying to get down to the very basics and saying, look at this, see where it takes you. I hope it levitates you above the normal into another realm to be explored. Because I think really to experience color, you need scale. Well, I want it to be ineffable. I want it to be something, if I could get the space, I would like something that is consuming. I think you have to, you're talking about Rothko, I think that when you sit in front of a Rothko, you have to purge all your other distractions out of yourself. Now, activity takes very different forms, right? One is looking at something, two, around it, sometimes going back to it. I have this thing about museums. One, I think museums should be free. Libraries are free. Why aren't museums free? Two, I think when you go to a museum, you don't go there to look at everything in the museum, which people do. I think you don't go to a library and try to read all the books. You try to go to a museum and look at one or two paintings and let that painting direct your feeling about a particular work of art. I think it's very important to slow down the process and actually look at something and then leave. I think it's a challenge these days with the electronic world. Well, I think I have found a language, and the language obviously is color. I think within the context of that, it's trying to get a holistic experience into one or two works of art. And I think that's the major problem. How do you find the absolute core to what you're trying to do and develop it in a work of art? A lot of that has to do with your intuition, where you collect all this information up and somehow you absorb it. And you say, well, this is the circumstance that I sort of have to think about. How can I embody all of this together into something that brings more of the experience together? And that on a daily basis is sort of what I deal with. That means I get up, I try to conceptually develop something that I think has the core of what I'm trying to do. Then that's related to a formal idea of how I'm going to structure this thing to get at this information. So it's a difficult dialogue. Every artist has a conceptual idea and a formal idea. The formal idea is how you bring it to birth. The conceptual idea is what the idea is. In certain works of art, I've found that I, as a viewer, are taken to another level. And that level has to do with a very remarkable experience. I've found it in several works of art. I hope that they have a similar experience. And through that experience, they start to understand that human endeavor, a human being is here in a certain way to experience things in a very positive way. I'm very upset about all of this war, all of this genocide. And I think a great deal of it comes out of the fact that people are not using their sensibility in a way that you would have to use to look at a work of art. And I think if they would look at other people in the same way that you would look at a work of art, they would come to some realization that there is a kind of human endeavor. But that's my idealism.